thank you to everyone for attending and honouring the late Emeritus Professor Don Aitkin AO this evening, including Vice-Chancellor Professor Paddy Nixon, members of the Aitkin family, members of the University Council, our esteemed speaker for the evening, David Pocock, staff, I've affected his PowerPoint already, staff and friends. Our Chancellor, Professor Tom Calmer, sends his apologies. He can't make it this evening because he's attending the ceremony for the announcement of the ACT Australian of the Year award winners. And given that I'm here, we can assume I haven't won. At the end of the lecture tonight, there will be a short Q&A session, followed by some closing remarks from a member of the Aitkin family, Mr. Jesse Aitkin. After formalities, we also invite you to join us in the foyer for light refreshments and to connect more with each other. Just some housekeeping rules. Please be aware that this evening's lecture is being recorded for those who are unable to join us here in person. You'll all receive access to the recording after today. Bathroom facilities are available outside of the room, down the corridor and to the right. And there is a water station available at the back of the room during the lecture. In case of emergency, please follow the arrows at the back and through here to the emergency evacuations. Instituted by the University of Canberra, the UC Aitkin Lecture, previously known as the Don Aitkin Lecture and last year the Don Aitkin Memorial Lecture, was inaugurated in 2005 with Don himself presenting the very first lecture. This renowned lecture series is delivered by prominent Australian and international scholars, bringing to bear their research and insights on major contemporary social, scientific and cultural issues. The lectures bring to the university distinguished scholars, artists and critics for discussion, debate, seminars and workshops, and enable a variety of interactions with staff, students and the community at large. This evening's lecture is the second one delivered since Don's passing in April 2002, and we're honoured to have Don's family here tonight as we continue his legacy at the university. Don was an elder statesman of the university and served as Vice-Chancellor and President for 11 years from 1991 until his retirement in 2002. He remains the longest serving Vice-Chancellor to date. After his retirement, Don continued to engage with UC as an adjunct member of the staff, a philanthropic donor and a valued contributor to our community. Presenters of the UC Aitkin Lecture have included the likes of Chief Minister Andrew Barr, John Dawkins AO, Robin Archer AO, Virginia Houseegger AM, Professor Peter Riddell, the Honourable Margaret Reid AO and Stan Grant. And today we will add to this list David Pocock. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our 2023 UC Aitkin Lecture presenter, David Pocock. Having migrated from Zimbabwe with his family as a teenager, David went on to captain the Wallabies and was vice-captain of our UC Brumbies as part of a stellar rugby career in which he received awards for his leadership both on and off the field. With a Masters in Sustainable Agriculture, David also has a track record as a powerful advocate on issues ranging from climate to marriage equality. He's been involved in multiple small businesses and has co-founded numerous not-for-profit community initiatives in Australia and overseas, including with his wife Emma. In 2021, David attended the COP26 Climate Summit and led the Cool Down campaign that saw over 470 Australian athletes from over 40 sports call on the Australian government to lift its ambition on climate change. Upon returning home, he announced his run as the community-endorsed independent Senate candidate for the ACT. After campaigning on a platform of integrity, doing politics different, and making Canberra count, David was successfully elected at the 21st of May 2022 federal election. This evening, David will be speaking to us about being citizens of the land. He will discuss the challenging, difficult, and eminently relevant question of what it means to live as a citizen of the land. While he is well known in Australia for his rugby career and his transition to federal politics, this evening we will see David drawing on his agricultural and conservation knowledge and advocacy work in sustainability, climate change, and equity. Please join me in welcoming David to the stage.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Wally, for the generous welcome and for all that you do in our community. It is a real privilege to live on Ngunnawal country. Thanks to Paddy and the team at UC for this opportunity and for the great work that you do in our community, and also to the Aitkin family, members of the Aitkin family, being here. This is my first, and who knows, potentially my last lecture. So welcome all. I do have some slides, not to talk to them, but hopefully just have something to look at rather than looking at me the whole time. Because this evening I want to talk about nature and our place in it. We're living in a time where the climate and biodiversity crises threaten everything we know and love about the places we live. Things are dire. I don't need to tell you that. We've seen the facts and figures, and if we've been paying attention, we've seen the changes in our lifetimes. Yet so far, we've collectively failed to act. I find it hard to understand why we haven't. I know there are vested interests and an economic system that doesn't factor in the whole cost of something, a system that seems all too happy to externalize costs to the environment. And then there's us humans' checkered history of managing common pool resources. But why haven't we cared enough to find ways to change given what's at stake? How have we built and propped up a culture that looks set to undermine the very health of this continent we call our home and rely on for everything? How do we change this? Obviously far from the first person to grapple with these questions. And you'll be unsurprised to learn I don't have the answers for you today. And maybe fortunately, because people aren't probably looking for answers from politicians. But I really don't see this as a talk by a politician. I'm here as a fellow Canberran grappling with questions about how we can rise to meet the challenges of our time. And I do have questions. I've got lots of questions, and I think asking questions is important. Maybe by collectively thinking about the questions we should be asking and refining those questions, seeking our own individual and collective answers to those questions, we'll build something that will help guide us in the face of these unprecedented challenges. Something that will guide us to a different way of relating to the places we live, to the land that sustains us, and ultimately to a different future. Rather than just being against things, we need to be able to imagine, to talk about them, and paint a compelling picture that shows what we're for. What are we for? What do we want? So rather than bludgeoning you with facts and figures tonight, I want to tell you a personal story about why I think our home, this place we live, the natural world, nature, whatever you prefer to call it, is worth fighting for, and attempt to offer some thoughts and questions to move the discussion forward. My family arrived in Australia in September 2002. My first flight on a jumbo jet, QF64, was the flight that changed our family's lives. I grew up on a farm in the Midlands of Zimbabwe, and I had a fascination with nature. I'm not sure where it started, but it often consumed my young mind. There was so much to learn. This led me to, as a 10-year-old, write to National Geographic to correct one of their articles on cheetah. They were in fact correct. They sent me a nice little package showing why I was wrong, which I greatly appreciated. I spent an entire holiday working on a voluntary bird project on the red-billed quelea, and handed in to my teacher, much to her amusement, at the start of the next term. And this interest was nurtured by exposure to wild places. I was fortunate enough to spend holidays on my grandfather's wildlife farm, or in Wangé National Park, or fishing on Lake Kariba. But even though I was lucky enough to see some incredible things as a kid, I remember having questions about how things were changing. I listened to stories from my dad. He talked about when his grandfather first started farming in that area, and there was still lion and some buffalo around. When my dad was a kid, the lion and buffalo were gone, but there was some sable that were seen in the area. When I was a kid, I remember the two separate occasions where a sable and a buffalo came through the district, and it was big news. And some people are happy just to shrug and say, well, that's progress, count your blessings, enjoy your quality of life. But for a 10-year-old, it didn't quite cut it. And I wanted to be able to see the majestic sable on our farm. Further down south, where my mum's family farmed, there were Bushman paintings on the farm. And one of the paintings we used to visit, this one, was of a rhino that had been pretty remarkably preserved. And my grandfather told me stories of back in the 50s when there was still some black rhino hanging on in the area. And by the time I was a boy asking these questions, black rhino were long gone. They were, in my mind, they were as long gone as the Bushmen in that area. And it led me down the path of beginning to wonder, what did this place look like in the past? What was here before? And what could it look like in the future? We disembarked our connecting flight in Brisbane and were picked up by friends who had immigrated a few years before us. They lived in the Redland Bay area and had generously offered for us to stay with them for as long as it took to find a place to live and get on our feet. And the first morning we were up at the crack of dawn and out the house with our friends. They had four boys of similar ages to me and my younger brothers. And I remember walking outside the house and I saw this thing. It was some sort of dove, which you had in Southern Africa, but this thing on its head, incredible, a crested pigeon. I'd never seen anything like it before. Across the road, sulphur-crested cockatoos. What incredible birds, so big and seemingly unafraid of humans. Growing up, the Mayor's parrot was the only parrot that we saw in our part of where we lived in Zimbabwe, and I was obsessed with them. If I ever heard their calls, I'd grab the sort of family binos and be out the house trying to hunt down this pair or little flock that were usually up in the top of leadwood trees. I was so fascinated by them, I spent hours making funnel traps and catching them so I could get a closer look. And now here in my new home, there were parrots everywhere. Rainbow lorikeets, I mean, these are colours are obscene. You know, if the Mayor's parrot could see these guys, they would think, what a bunch of upstart Australians showing off these colours. The galahs, the exquisite pink and grey. King parrots, how big are they? These huge parrots, the red and the green, and then that paler green on the wings. That first morning, it blew my mind seeing the birds here, and we were walking through this parkland, taking in this strange new world, this place that had such a different feel and a different smell. And then we saw it, and when we all started to yell, "Koala, koala, look at the koala!" And there it was, a koala at the base of a eucalypt, starting to climb up the tree. My jet-lagged mind really struggled to fully take in that we were seeing a koala my very first day in Australia. This place is a nature paradise. Koalas in the parklands, birds everywhere. What an incredible place we'd moved to. And I don't remember much else from that period. We soon found a little rental in the suburbs. The upstairs bedrooms apparently doubled as saunas in the Brisbane summer, but we got through. And I didn't see another koala in the wild for well over a decade. In fact, apart from kangaroos and wallabies and possums walking along backyard fences, I didn't see many animals at all. And I just assumed that the birds here are really cool, but there's basically no mammals apart from those things here in Australia. And to be honest, I've actually found the bush pretty boring, if I can admit that. And then a year 10 geography assignment on Norman Creek, a tributary to the Brisbane River, got me thinking. We were looking at water quality and catchment management and council policy. When it comes to runoff, we inspected rubbish traps. We had an amazing geography teacher. And we knew that school students used to swim in the creek. And now it stank, and there was definitely no swimming in the year, when was it, 2003. And then doing some research for my final project for this year of geography, I came across reports about Brisbane River baths being shut in the 30s. And the report said the visibility was 3 to 6 meters. I don't know if anyone's seen the Brisbane River, but that blew my mind. 3 to 6 meters, that's very hard to imagine visibility anywhere in the Brisbane River that's 3 to 6 meters. And this really, I don't know, something twigged in my brain in year 10, and I thought, oh, hang on, maybe this place has also changed and is changing. What did this place look like in the past? What was here before? And what could it look like in the future? In the years since then, as I've learned more about the land here and spent time along its rivers and coast, I've fallen more and more in love with it. The wonder of the landscapes and wildlife, the sadness about what we've lost and are losing, but also the hope and excitement for what they could look like in the future. The biological diversity on this continent is truly mind-blowing. Here, the place where birdsong began, the land of parrots, the place where you can see all three ways of being mammal: marsupial, placental, and monotreme. The island that is home to 14% of all the world's reptiles. A land that has Gondwanan rainforest, boxgum woodland, temperate grasslands, tropical savannas, coral reefs, sphagnum bogs. Add your favourite landscape to the list. They're all here. I began to grapple with how it is that we can live on a megadiverse continent, be one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and at the same time know we're destroying life on this continent, know we are pushing ecosystems to breaking point and beyond, pushing species to extinction, and be seemingly unwilling to act, to spend more, to do what is necessary to look after our home, to look after the place that sustains us. And even if, as a culture, we don't recognize the inherent value of the non-human world, it is, at the end of the day, in our self-interest. Looking after nature is looking after ourselves, because we're part of nature. And if nature goes down, we're going down with her. How do we get people to think about, to care about this more? It's something I often ask Emma while we're sitting along the Murrumbidgee River enjoying the views, or watching a platypus feeding in the rapids. The car park is mostly empty and we rarely see other people out there. This wonderland on Canberra's doorstep. The question's a bit unfair in a way because we know people do care. We know Australians love nature and we've seen the huge outpouring of support. After the bushfires, there's a long history of campaigns to save parts of this incredible continent, from the Franklin, the Jabiluka blockade in Kakadu, hundreds being arrested to try and protect Laird State Forest and other places. Campaigns both successful and unsuccessful. But we've also seen governments elected and re-elected who allow and subsidise the destruction of nature, or governments that get by with marketing and spin and throwing a few scraps to the increasingly desperate environmental NGO sector without a major party they can truly get behind. I probably spent too much time, and I know this gets annoying for Emma at times, so I apologise, sitting there saying, do you think the rivers always run this muddy brown? How many more platypus do you reckon it had 200 years ago? What do you reckon it would look like if there was better catchment management? When do you reckon the last time a regent honeyeater flew past here? Us humans are meaning-seeking animals. All cultures developed collective myths, ways of making sense of the world around us and informing our place in it. And for much of Homo sapiens' history, these were grounded in nature. First Nations myths, Dreamtime stories still are. For Indigenous cultures, the land is not separate from who they are. They are from the land and part of it. But the Western myths that have guided many of us seem to be rooted instead in religious beliefs that privilege heaven over earth and say that the earth is the dominion of humans. This was certainly my upbringing. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Enlightenment led to a more scientific study of nature, but at the same time, there was a departure from living with nature to dominating it, manipulating and destroying it in the name of a narrow conception of progress. And this trend has obviously continued and accelerated. The rush towards technology has been incredible for so many aspects of our lives, but it's done little to improve our connection with nature. We seem to have collectively lost sight of the fact that we are part of nature and entirely reliant on it for our survival. You can turn on the news. Mainstream reporting on environment issues is not that common. And all too often, they're framed as zero-sum. We can either have economic prosperity and a standard of living, or we can protect nature. We can't do both. It seems that we maybe still have a frontier mentality where the land is there to be subjugated, mined, and turned into economic value. And I've frankly found it deeply troubling and confusing how caring about the environment is seen as something only for greenies and tree huggers in Australia. In places like Southern Africa, my experience has been that conservation transcends the political spectrum. That a love for the natural world is not tied to a political worldview. And perhaps that's because a larger portion of the population derive a direct income from the land. I'm not sure. But the idea that a conservation ethic made you a greenie was something that I only learned when I moved to Australia. Of course, we've seen this challenged over the years. We've seen pushback, scientists and others urging us to care, communities pushing back against environmental destruction, asking decision makers to prioritise a healthy environment. More and more people recognise the desperate need to not only care, but act. Farmers starting to work with rather than against natural systems. Farmers who were ridiculed for decades are now finding people more receptive. Food consumers becoming more interested in where their food actually comes from. There is much work happening on private land and across the country in Indigenous protected areas. But clearly, for a culture to be able to destroy the very land base that sustains it, our collective myths need updating. This is urgent work and will require learning about and loving the places we live and developing a new sense of who we are and what we care about. It's a project we can all play a role in. Changing culture, developing stories about our place in the world that resonate and provide meaning and direction. And this work has obviously already begun, and it will take time. But time is not something that a lot of landscapes and species have. So thankfully there are other things that we can be doing that will slow, even halt, the decline while contributing to this new land ethic. Being in places that face the prospect of being destroyed, like parts of Laird State Forest before it was bulldozed for a coal mine, or parts of Takina, the Tarkine in Tasmania that was slated for logging, or a mining tailings dam, it struck me that you won't love things that you don't know about, and you won't fight for things you don't love. You can't love things you don't know about. And you won't fight for something that you don't love. How do we expect Australians to care for the land if most of us are never taught what is here and what was here? How can we love something we don't know about? Between 1888 and 1927, at least 8 million koalas were killed for the fur trade, with their pelts shipped to London, the US, and Canada. Between 1888 and July 1918, at least 4 million koala furs passed through London auction houses alone, and this figure doesn't include records from the war years of 1911 to 1914. This was obviously eventually ended and koalas became a protected species, but their population has continued to decline due to land clearing and more recently bushfires. Koalas are now endangered in Queensland, New South Wales, and here in the ACT. And to be really upfront here, I haven't talked about koalas because I'm particularly fond of them. They are incredible, but give me a platypus or a quoll or a numbat any day. I talk about them because of the personal story of seeing them on our very first day in Australia, and because they're so iconic, so emblematic of our wildlife. And at this point, I'd also like to offer my sincerest apologies to some of the ecologists in the room who are maybe cringing, wondering why the koala gets so much focus yet again, when it's arguably a little bit questionable how much they contribute to our ecosystems. They eat a lot of eucalyptus leaves, they poo, they sleep. But here's another politician talking about koalas. What about the ecosystem engineers? I can hear you saying. The mammals, birds, and reptiles that dig, burrow, rake through leaf litter and pollinate the bush, bettongs, bandicoots, bilbies, potoroos, and others. Who's talking about them and standing up for them? What about the soil and microbiota and plants that keep this whole show on the road? I've only got 40 minutes up here, but I'm going to see what I can do. But back to our ecosystem engineer friends. It took me many years to learn that we're missing dozens of small marsupials from our landscapes. They turned over soil for millennia and quite literally helped shape the landscapes that we love. A single bilby turns over around 20 tons of soil a year. And these little marsupials, the bilbies, the bettongs, really got me excited about what our landscapes could be like again. They sparked my imagination and changed the way I experienced being outdoors in Australia. While they're largely gone from land across the continent, there is some exciting work being done to reintroduce them to islands and fenced areas after cats and foxes have been removed, including at Mulligan's Flat here in the ACT. Wombats and echidnas and lyrebirds and other ecosystem engineers are still out there, but even some of them are under pressure. As well as learning more about this place, how do we start to live like we'll be here for a long time? This is something we really got to grapple with, because in Parliament House I just see so much short-term decision making. We know that European invasion in the last 200 years have brought many of this continent's ecosystems to the brink. How do we start maturing as a society, planning and making decisions that mean the next generation will benefit from landscapes that are recovering and being better managed? And to me, this seems even more important after the Voice referendum. How do we learn from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples about connection with the places we live, to stop dominating and to start belonging, to make decisions with the truly long term in mind? After moving to Canberra in 2012, I decided to try and read a few books. I knew very little about this area, and one of the books I picked up was on the Australian alpine areas, and it talked about the annual meeting of people groups that approach from valleys in all directions, following rivers, following song lines. It was a time to sort out disagreements, a time for ceremony, before then heading up to the peaks for bogong moth hunting and feasting. If you all think of a place that your family loves, how many years have you lived there or gone there for Easter break or for Christmas? Maybe since you were a kid, maybe it's your grandparents that started going there. The authors of this book talked about people going to the same campgrounds for over 600 generations. 600 generations. And then this continuous connection year on year was broken in the space of just 30 years. First Nations people were pushed out by graziers, many killed, others relocated. Ways of living and relating to land that were crudely dismissed and in many cases lost in mere decades. Indigenous people have been trying to share their knowledge for centuries. Early Europeans who showed interest in platypus were told by First Nations people that they laid eggs. There's many accounts of this. Platypus lay eggs. 100 years later, British scientist William Caldwell proclaimed to the world that he had discovered that platypuses lay eggs. And it's easy to dismiss this ignorance as a symptom of arrogance, early colonialism, but the reality is that this attitude has echoed through time to the present day. We still do not listen and act on Indigenous knowledge about land management. There is certainly more listening, but not enough of what we hear is being implemented. I heard a story recently about the ACT government wanting to allow more cultural burning. Great news. We all know in Canberra how important these practices are. I was talking to these Ngunnawal rangers who said that they found a place that was ideal, got in touch with the managers and the bureaucracy. They were told to lodge their paperwork, and almost 2 years later, they got a call to say, hey, you've got permission to do that cool burn. I don't want to mansplain to you, but a lot can happen in 2 years. And that area was not suitable for a cool burn anymore. It's an anecdote, but it really is it highlights some of the dismay that I hear from First Nations land managers across the country about the system's failures, which prevent them from actually managing landscapes that they've managed for hundreds and hundreds of generations. We've clearly never needed First Nations knowledge and wisdom more than now. The knowledge of learning about a place, of loving a place, not in a love that puts a photo on social media and maybe hangs a photo on the wall, but does nothing to ensure it's looked after. But a love in your bones that means that you care for it, that you're willing to fight for it. And I think our lack of focus on our natural history, on ecological literacy and learning from this continent's First Peoples means that we are all too susceptible to what can be called shifting baseline syndrome. Seeing what we see as normal and beautiful and as good as it gets. You go for a drive and you think, wow, this is as it should be. And it's really testament to just how amazing this continent is and the resilience of nature, that it is still so beautiful. But we know that many, far too many, systems have changed a great deal, have been degraded, and many are close to collapse. We can never go back to the landscapes that were here in 1788. But we need the imagination to work towards what they could be. We need to be willing to learn what it was like, to challenge the shifting baselines that have been accepted from generation to generation if we are to halt the rapid decline in biodiversity around us. And there are many people working on this. I've had the good fortune of being able to visit farms and conservation projects doing these very things. There's something very special about walking on land that has had its species returned to it over 100 years, after 100 years or more absence. And we need to support these developing solutions, fence reserves, other solutions to deal with invasive species, ways to incentivize farmers to produce food and fibre in ways that work with nature, not against her. Indigenous rangers caring for country and managing landscapes, and ultimately ensuring all of this is scaled by government policies and investment. We need the courage to push governments and decision makers to stop doing things we know are destroying nature. We look back at the koala fur trade and think, wow, what a different time. Thank goodness we've changed. Yet we're still cutting down old growth forests at a loss. No longer viable. The native forest industry is being funded by public money. Our taxpayer money is turning native forests into wood chips and box liners. And we have environmental laws that don't work. In a climate and biodiversity crisis, these laws still allow us to be a global deforestation hotspot, the only developed economy to hold this dubious title. The new government has obviously committed to rewriting them, but getting it right will require political courage. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to get Australian environmental law that will actually protect nature. We're yet to see the urgency and ambition necessary for something that we so desperately need. And again, before we get too self-righteous here in the ACT, we have a government that could be so much better at preserving our remaining box gum woodland and temperate grasslands. The government is building new suburbs with little tree cover for humans and wildlife. The Territory government doesn't seem to have the gumption to protect somewhere like Blewett's Block. And the Territory government continues to plant invasive weeds on sidewalks and in our park. Here's some recently planted ivy in Acton, coming to a parkland near you soon. I'm told by the Territory Government that they replant non-native trees for their heritage values. But I would argue, what could be more heritage than the plants that originally grew here? We welcome spring with one of our biggest festivals, a celebration of tulips. One of our most well-maintained outdoor areas is a collection of non-native trees. And I'm not knocking Floreat or the Arboretum. They bring a lot of joy to Canberrans, and they probably have a place in a city, but I think they point to what we currently value as a culture. We know here in the ACT our ranges are stretched, they're being asked to do more and more. There's weeds everywhere that they're having to deal with over the last few years, and there's obviously room for improvement when it comes to controlling things like cats and foxes. There's work to be done everywhere we look. And so I'd argue that we desperately need to recognise the importance of public investment in nature. Nature will always be a public good, and to save it will take real and substantial investment in environmental protection, threatened species projects, and regeneration work in landscapes. I've been disappointed by the lack of ambition shown by the current Labor government on this need. Strong commitments like that of no new extinctions have not been backed up by the investment required to make that happen. Rather than stepping up, the first major reform brought by the Labor government was for a biodiversity market, partially based on an unsolicited proposal from PwC. Markets and the use of efficient use of private capital clearly have a role to play. But given the limited resources for reform, it was disappointing to see this rather than a recognition that public investment in nature is as critical as it is worthwhile. The government recently boasted that they are spending more than ever on the environment, $4.8 billion over the next 4 years. That's $1.2 billion across the entire continent and includes things like recycling and the Bureau of Meteorology. And even including all those things, we're looking at 0.19% of our federal budget. 0.19% spent on the environment portfolio. Which makes you ask, are we funding the environment like we believe we're going to be here for a long time? Are we funding it like we believe we're part of nature and rely on nature for survival? Are we funding the environment like we love it and value it? And 1.2 billion out of $628 billion probably says no, we're not yet. And this desperately needs to change. As one of the wealthiest countries in the world, we can afford this. And to borrow a line from the Deputy Prime Minister, when the government announced that we'd be spending $368 billion acquiring nuclear submarines, we can't afford not to. That was his reason. Giving a lecture is clearly not my natural environment, but talking to you about the need for our communities, our society to connect with the places we live and protect what matters is an incredible privilege. When you're passionate about something, it's hard to know what to cover and what needs to be left out. I've tried to share my journey to learn about and love this land, as I think there are many, many Australians who are on that journey, because it's a lifelong journey. I've talked about the need for new myths that locate us as part of nature and give meaning to looking after and working to regenerate and restore parts we have mismanaged or neglected. The need to embrace the Indigenous understanding that if you look after country, country will look after you. As a country largely made up of immigrants and living in cities, we're particularly susceptible to shifting baselines. learning about the truth of this land's history and the world around us, and beginning to love it will lead us to ask, what did this place look like in the past? What was here before? And what could it look like in the future? We need to stop doing the things that just make no sense, like cutting down native forests at a loss, or preferencing the bulldozing of important habitat over building houses closer to the services residents will depend on, or having our creeks concreted over and parks full of non-native trees. It's not hard to feel anxious about the future. I hope this hasn't been too much of a downer. Feeling anxious about the future is, I think, frankly, entirely appropriate. But the antidote to despair is action, is getting involved. And all across the country, there are people taking action. We can join them. We must join them. We need all Australians to join them. Because at a time when this all just feels so desperate and urgent, which it is, we need to channel that into solutions and not allow despair to stop us from acting. As a country, we have 60,000 years of knowledge and wisdom to call upon, to learn from. We have some of the world's best environmental scientists desperately working to develop solutions. We have an opportunity to find the right way to intersect Western conservation science with Indigenous knowledge, putting the right fire in the right place, and no fire in some ecosystems like tall wet eucalyptus forest and Gondwana rainforest. We've seen heroic efforts to stop the destruction of places, campaigns against logging and habitat destruction. Many people know what they're against. The other part of the task is knowing what we're for. I'm for a place where we find ways to live amongst nature. A future where there are more koalas and numbats and gliders in 5 years than there are today. A place where the Murrumbidgee River isn't so starved of water it runs dry during periods of drought. A place that prioritises environmental investment and recognises that our health, both physical, mental, and spiritual, depends on a healthy environment. In Australian politics, we're about to have a rare opportunity to stand up and achieve a change that will be reflected by generations to come. I truly believe that this government, this parliament, will be judged on whether we're able to act in the face of the climate and biodiversity crises. And I'll be doing everything I can to ensure that in 10, 20, 50 years' time, we can look back and say that this was the moment that the declines started to be reversed. We made that decision. There is so much worth saving, and we can choose to do so. What a gift to be alive today, to be here in this moment. Thank you.
David, thank you. We have had all had our consciences raised that we have to act together, and I think putting that in the terms of love and our love for nature is what's going to change this. It's something that I think we can all take hold of. David and I are now going to move to the red chairs, and there will be the opportunity for questions. We're going to throw our first question open to Vice Chancellor President Paddy Nixon. So think of your question as I run over there to get the mics, and someone will hand you a mic, I think.
So David, thank you very much for the presentation. I particularly want to say thank you for reminding me of the absolute awe I had when I moved here in 2010 to Tasmania, and just seeing some of the amazing natural environment that was there. And I started to take it for granted. So this evening has been a real switch to remind myself to look a little bit more carefully. I just want, my problem is not what question, it's which question to ask. But I wanted to put this to you. Just at the end there, you said there are people who are acting to try and change this around the country. And it brought to my mind that notion of an activist. And of course, we need activists to change the world. But actually, what we need at this point in time is every citizen to be part of that. And that movement from activism to mainstream is the challenge I think we face. And I'll put my hand up and be slightly, perhaps embarrassed to say this, but I absolutely believe in everything you've done, but I've never actually taken those steps to be a little bit more active in changing things. How do we make it mainstream and not activism?
It's a great question. One of the privileges about living in Australia is that our democracy works. And that's one way we can get those things scaled. Because, ultimately the decisions that you and I make, whilst important, add up to nothing unless they're scaled by politics. And I think we're at a point now where it really is the political will that we need in investing in these solutions. You talk to scientists who are working on incredible research to tackle invasive species, and they can't get a grant. Struggle to get a dollar to keep doing that. And so I think it's a big way is making the people that represent you aware that, hey, this matters. Like, we can afford to do this. This is not going to send us broke as a country. This is a huge opportunity. So I think that's, you need the activists, you need the trailblazers in agriculture and conservation who are out there doing stuff. Now it's up to us to say, this matters, and hey, Mr. or Ms., if you don't back this, I'm going to look for a different candidate at the next election to vote for. I think that's when we'll see that shift.
If I can ask a little corollary, just because I got the mic and then I'll hand it away so someone else is. I was really dismayed this week to see that old growth log going down the main street of Hobart that was in the news. And I lived in Hobart in Tasmania. Democracy isn't working there to stop those simple things. Yet that's probably one of the greenest places in Australia. How do we encourage that democracy you're talking about for us all to just take an active decision?
I think telling the truth about what we're doing is a start, and I think most people wouldn't know that Tasmanians have shelled out, I think it's $1.6 billion over the last 20 years to prop up the cutting down of their native forests, 90% of which are going to be chipped and pulped and made into box liners and exported as a high volume, low value product. And just what that's doing, and you'd know in Tassie the sort of culture wars over logging, I think, then point to some of the other bit I was talking about this land ethic and what does it mean to live and make decisions like, we're here for a long time. We've got these old growth forests. We can look after them because we're custodians rather than just churning through them. So it probably touches on a bunch of those things, but yeah, it's a really tough one down there.
Got a question?
Hello, David. What about our eastern grey kangaroos? They've been killed every single day, violently. Infertility program, they're being genetically altered. They're committing mass extinction of them. What about learning to coexist with them instead of killing them and turning them into the multi-billion-dollar tourist attraction that they would be alive? They're worth more money alive than what they are dead. That'll be a global thing. Everybody overseas want to come here and see them alive, coexisting with them. We've started a movement, actually. We're going to have regular meetings on that. So would you be into helping with that?
Sure, I'd be happy to chat more, and I know we've chatted about this before. Yeah, one of the things that is doing well is Eastern Grey. They are flourishing. You know, there's more water across the country with so much of it being used for agriculture and livestock, and they're really thriving. Their numbers are through the roof. So there's a lot of species that I think we've really got to be concerned about. I don't think the Eastern Grey is one of them. I'm happy to chat more. I know we have chatted about this before. You know, the Fenner School, the ANU does a heap of work looking at and working with places like Mulligan's and elsewhere, looking at Eastern Grey populations and population dynamics and the sustainability of that in the ACT.
Up at the back. Thank you.
Yes, question. Thank you very much, David. This was a very good lecture, and this is the best I've heard from a public person that says himself that it can't do it. It was great, and the message is terrific. But my question is, well, and of course I voted for you because integrity. What you say about democracy, we don't live in a democracy because the opposition comes to power and they do the same thing what the opposition said when they were in government. So, and it's a non-commitment of the real issue. And integrity is that you do what you think. And what you now talk about is you love for the nature and you're going to do what you think. So my question is, after being in Parliament now for so many months, years, how do you assess the integrity? How can you deal with integrity? Because like this whole environmental policy that was in the newspapers again, the rewriting of it, 10,000 pages, that it's just fiddling with the margins. It's not really cutting the chase. So my question is, how can you change that? How can you stand up that what you say is what you have to do as a government? And this government, I agree with you, we are at a point that we can change. But what I see now from the government is that nothing happens. It all goes back to the old. Thank you.
Whew, that's a good one. I mean, one of the things I've seen over the last year and a half is that there are a lot of good people in there who genuinely care. The party system doesn't necessarily allow them to do good stuff, and I think you're right. Some of the choices, there's very little difference on a whole bunch of issues. We have to get the EPBC, the nature laws, right. They're not working, and I think it's frankly going to be a really big fight to push the government to actually do that and to create enough awareness and concern amongst the public, which is a huge task. We don't know what we're losing. We don't know what's at stake more generally. And I think it comes down to a whole bunch of things I mentioned, not knowing the truth about these landscapes, not learning about it at school. I mean, I only did a few years of school here, but I certainly never learned about just how incredible this place is and how much pressure it's under. Then there's the reporting. You very seldom see nature in the news. I guess the crux of your question is, like, how do we change that? A minority government, maybe? That's a bit cheeky, but yeah, I guess we've got to keep pushing them, and it's going to take everyone. You know, activists continuing to raise concerns, and then more and more Australians saying, well, hang on, I actually do care about that thing. And maybe in the past, it wasn't up the top of my voting priorities, but no, I want to make it happen now. And so Labor essentially have a choice. They could do environmental law updates, rewrite it all with the coalition, or they can do that with the crossbench. And we still don't know what they're gonna choose. So a bit more time to go.
Okay, and just one final question up the back. Thank you.
Thanks, David. You do speak in a way that is really motivating, and a call to take what we have more seriously, so thank you for that. I was involved at school in '85 and you didn't swim the pocket then, for what it's worth. So it wasn't a thing, but that's an aside. I'm interested that you, in a way, live in a very progressive city. You've chosen to live here, and that's reflected in the recent referendum. And at the same time, you're happy to be honest about what's happening here as well. And I can't tell whether you're a federal politician that has the chance to influence Canberra as a prototype, as a benchmark, or whether that's beyond your remit. But I do think then when you go to issues of densification and how we tackle that, it's very complex. And we are doing new greenfields, suburbs, and we do go further afield. So my question to you is, as a federal minister, can you play a part in Canberra that can lead the way? Can the ACT government actually commit to those things, given it seems to hold power year after year? And could we be a prototype for the country?
Thanks. It's something that frustrates me as a Canberran, to be honest. Like, people often talk about us being such a progressive city, but I really think when it comes to conservation and land management, we are happy just kind of say, well, you know, half of the ACT is Namadgi and nature reserves, and we've got mulligans, and you know that's enough. But I think we've got one layer of government. This could be the place that really tries to tackle this and deals with the thorny issue of population growth, and what do you do with that, and where do you put people, and how do you develop a city. And you know, I think that takes a lot of imagination and consultation and some pretty tough conversations with communities. But certainly when it comes to our, I don't know, imagination and ambition, when it purely comes to like ecological issues and conservation, I've been pretty disappointed. And you know, something as a Canberran, I've butted heads with TCCS or whoever else over all sorts of things. And we'd love to see our ranges better resourced, see more money going into that, see more rangers like truly empowered to actually manage some of these landscapes. And so yeah, I think we could be a prototype. Like, it's all there to do, and I think Canberrans genuinely care. We've just got to push the Labor Greens government to deliver on this stuff. I think I mentioned Blewett's Block. I don't know if people know about it. It's this piece of land up above Denman Prospect. Incredible little area of dry forest, and like it's steep. It's really not suitable for housing. But the ACT government just won't even declare it a nature reserve, or despite big community support and pushing for it. That it just makes sense. So I don't know what's going on there, but there's a whole bunch of things like this that I think we need to keep pushing them on.
And if we're going to be the test bed, then I think we have to take the lesson from you that we can't just leave it to one person. So let's take up that challenge. But I want to thank you for giving us your time and your insights this evening. You now join a very esteemed catalogue of the Aitkin lecturers at the University of Canberra. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks for having me, everyone. Cheers.